Hey everyone, welcome to week 2. And what I wanted to do today was to create a lecture in which we shift gears and start talking about the rhetoric and argument part of class. That really is the basis of our class. So I think it's important in week 2 that we establish what is rhetoric and what is argument. So the first thing we should know is that rhetoric and argument is linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we can start talking about argument, we need to talk about rhetoric. And so if this is a ground class, the first thing I would do is I would ask students to take out a piece of paper and write down how they would define rhetoric. And basically there are 3 groups of students. There are the students who are pretty confident that they know what rhetoric is. There's a group of students who have heard the term but don't know what it's mean. And then there are some of the students who just straight up say, they've never heard the term rhetoric, so they don't know what it means. So if you're in that last category, no problem, that's kind of normal. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is kind of walk you through the steps of helping you to understand what is rhetoric. So generally, because sometimes students say they don't know what rhetoric is, what I first say as I ask, is it safe that we can assume that there are people who use rhetoric? And just about any class, students will say, yeah, we know that there are people who use rhetoric. So we have to figure out who are those people that use rhetoric. So in any class I take, the first group that students always associate rhetoric with is politicians. Politicians always use rhetoric. So if you think about it, in the last couple of years, you might have heard things like Donald Trump was using rhetoric. You might hear today that President Biden is using rhetoric. Okay, so you might have heard the word. We know that they use words, but we don't know what the meaning is. So it's safe to say that we can always assume that politicians use rhetoric. The second group that students always associate with rhetoric are lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. Then sometimes students can come up with people like who else might use rhetoric. Say teachers use rhetoric, right? An English teacher might use rhetoric. A philosopher might use rhetoric. So basically what we've done here is we just want to establish who are the people who use rhetoric. We know that politicians use rhetoric. We know that lawyers use rhetoric. We know teachers use rhetoric. And even to some extent, students use rhetoric. They may not be very good at it, but they definitely use rhetoric. So once we figured out that, okay, we know that there are people who use rhetoric, I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. Might be a form of rhetoric. So a form of rhetoric, if we know that politicians use rhetoric, I always tell students, hey, I have a guest speaker. So imagine if just right next to me on the screen popped up former President Barack Obama, right? We know that Obama used rhetoric. So what is he doing when he used rhetoric? And so students will say things like, well, he's talking or he's speaking. And what he's doing is he's giving a speech. So a speech could be a form of rhetoric. Then sometimes when I use the example of Obama, I'll ask how many people have seen President Obama speak live in person. And every once in a while, I'll get a person who raises their hand. They've served in the military. They've seen Obama speak. But I say, how is it possible that you've seen Obama speak but not live in person? And they'll say TV. So TV could be a form of rhetoric. So if we ask that question, what else might be a form of rhetoric? Radio is a form of rhetoric. And then sometimes students say the internet's the greatest form of rhetoric. Emails, technology, things like Facebook. Then sometimes students will say things like books. So if a book is a form of rhetoric, the person that would be using that form of rhetoric would be an author. It could be a journalist. So if the journalist is the person who uses rhetoric, the form would be a newspaper. So notice, all we've done is I've said, okay, here are the people that use rhetoric. Politicians, lawyers, teachers, students. We know that there are forms of rhetoric, whether it be a speech, radio, TV, newspaper, the internet. Now I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. So throughout the first couple of weeks, I'm going to maintain my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And so what I want you to do is there's 2 other videos that I want you to watch that might give you a different perspective of rhetoric. And then there's a discussion board. And in that discussion board, You're just asked to, I want to know how you would define rhetoric based on my lecture and the 2 other videos. You can agree with me or you can disagree, but I'm going to maintain, as of week two, my definition of rhetoric is going to be words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And I look forward to seeing what you have to say, and we'll have a great week 2.